Hello and welcome to Your Story Stinks, the podcast where I talk about narrative issues with stories. I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm just getting over COVID. So if my voice is kind of weird, that's from that. Now, I will also say that I might rant a bit in this episode because every time I've tried to record it in the past couple weeks, I keep having to stop and start over because I keep remembering new things that are bad and which piss me off because there's so many of them. This is a truly bad story. It is bad on so many levels, and every time I pull at it to try to take a thread and run with it, I end up with a bunch more threads. It brings a whole lot of things with them. So all of the things I'm going to talk about are intertwined, and they can't really be separated, but they're their own things. I am, of course, talking about Absolute Power, which is at the time of recording this, most recent event comic from DC. DC Comics is in a horrible place right now in terms of their output. Like, I didn't think it could get worse when Geoff Johns was running the joint, but apparently it got worse. Now, longtime listeners of this, if any of those exist, will know of my deep-seated hatred for the way in which Geoff Johns tells stories. That's not a slight against him when it comes to creating things, when it comes to coming up with ideas. He's good at that. But he's not good at telling stories with them, because he doesn't know how to do the hard work. And if you don't do the hard work when you're adding new things, it just creates a mess. To put it bluntly, I often compare him to the big three in Shonen Jump. So the big three used to be Bleach, Naruto, and One Piece, and all three of them had the same problem of they kept expanding the scope, and all of them kind of failed to deal with that. But that's a different story. We're talking about Absolute Power. The reason this all comes together is that it used to be that the major problem with DC was that they had so many ideas and were going in so many directions that there was no focus, and they weren't able to coalesce around anything. And now the issue is that they have no ideas. And so they just keep rehashing bad ideas or creating a kind of stasis which feels like soul crushing. So, under Geoff Johns, a whole lot of creators left and joined Marvel, and you can see that. And so the ones that are there now that are telling good stories are only good at telling good stories on their own, disconnected from the rest of the nonsense that's going on with the wider DC universe, and that kind of sucks. You have the Wonder Woman comic that's going on right now, which is good, even though it's being told by Tom King, who can only write one kind of story, where he tells it out of order, like he's writing Pulp Fiction. And it's really annoying, but at least when he has focus, he can tell a good story. The problem is that he doesn't understand how to pay anything off, and every one of his comics has that problem. But at least he knows how to write an interesting story. There are other individual comics that are good, but they oftentimes get too wrapped up in giving creators that shouldn't have free reign. So they'll do things like give Scott Snyder free reign to do things like Dark Knight Metal, which is objectively bad in terms of storytelling. It has cool ideas in some ways, but in the way the story is told, it's just objectively bad. And they just keep giving him more and more work, and I don't understand it, because he is clearly incapable of telling a satisfying story. I don't think he understands the characters he writes. I'm looking at things like Absolute Batman and Absolute Superman, and I'm like, wow, you are writing the same comic that has been written with these two characters for the last 20 years. Nobody at DC is moving on. Nobody at DC is doing anything new. Nobody at DC is, coming up with anything that's like interesting or satisfying. This isn't even like reinventing the wheel. They're just mass producing the wheel and telling you that it's new. And that's kind of like the core issue with DC as a whole. And it bleeds into Absolute Power because Absolute Power is it's an event that draws from so many bad past events that have already been done for all of its story beats. Like, I kept thinking of King in Black from Marvel. And when I talked about King in Black years ago, I feel like the thing that I called it was paint by numbers, where everything that you expected to be in an event comic was in King in Black. And that's kind of how I feel about Absolute Power, where every story beat is exactly what you would expect. Like if you fed like ChatGPT and said, "Hey, write me the plot points in a story arc event comic for DC," this is what would come out. Like beat for beat, this is what would come out. And at least for Absolute Power, this is really bad. I don't know that it's so bad to rehash older ideas, especially if they haven't been done in a while, but they better be good ideas. And the problem is that Absolute Power doesn't have any ideas, so it's only taking from like the worst ideas possible. And a lot of them are recent, or at the very least within the last 20 years, which in my opinion is too soon to be rehashing ideas. Like, I give Marvel crap for doing things like that. Like, oh, we're going to do Civil War 2 like a decade after Civil War 1, even though everybody recognizes that Civil War was a horrendous idea, like, at the time and after the fact. But no, we're going to do it again. That's what Absolute Power is. Absolute Power, once again, forces the issue of, what if the superheroes were the bad guys? Which is, again, a concept which has been done over and over and over again by better writers with better ideas. And this is not either of those things. But there's more than that, or at the very least, there's more to it. Because they're also doing the what if all the superheroes didn't have powers, which again is another idea which has been done to death at this point. The one that came to mind, the comic that came to mind, or event I guess you could say, is the God Wave. So for those of you who don't remember, the God Wave was a concept of like, okay, there was a big bang and the like creation expanded outwards and then eventually hit the boundaries of the universe and reflected back. And so the wave was coming back. And as it came back, it depowered all the superheroes. Like, this was a concept they already did. There was another really bad comic, which the name escapes me, where all of the superhumans suddenly were depowered, and then they all went to Batman to learn from Batman, and Wonder Woman became a Christian. It was a very bad comic. I don't really remember what it was. I've blocked it out of my memory, but I remember reading it and hating it. There are some others that have done similar ideas, where, I don't remember, it was probably one of the Crisis events where they took all the different universes and they made them fight each other. So they like put the JSA universe with I forget the name of them. It's the guys who build all the weaponry, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head. For example, and the prelude to that was they trapped everybody in like domes and depowered them for a year. Like, that was the whole arc. Like, these are ideas they've done over and over and over again, and they're all kind of, like, boring, and none of them have been particularly, like, well done. Like, none of these are ideas that are being improved when they do them again. And, in fact, in this case, it's just kind of, like, I want to say lazy, because while I'm against things like, okay, you shouldn't make comics about the powers themselves, it should be about the people who are using them, like, this entire comic is just about the powers themselves, essentially. And it's not done in any way that's, Like, it's not adding anything. This is what I'm getting at. This part is hard to talk about because it's like, look at all these other comics that have already done these ideas, and while they were bad there, they were still done better than this. And that's a weird, hard thing to talk about and articulate. The other thing is that they're doing the same event, it feels like, that they've done 4 or 5 times now, where the world gets taken over by other superpowered beings. And it just ends, and then there's nothing to it. Like just off the top of my head, Forever Evil did this, where Earth 3 took over, and then Dark Multiverse did this with Black Knight, or Dark Knight Metal, and then I don't want to say Amazon's Attack did this, but it kind of did this. I forgot the event comic name where Atlantis took over the world. Like, they keep doing this, where it seems like they keep going global, but there's no point in it, because all the superheroes that they use, for the most part, are all in the United States. And so they keep making the stakes global or multiversal or whatever, and none of it makes sense. And they don't even bother to, like, hide what they're doing. And in fact, this scope actually makes the story less interesting. And again, I'm going to do a rant about this because this comic fails on the bigger your scope, the bigger your problems. And I feel like every comic, or every video I do like this, every video I do has this same problem where I'm going, hey, you keep expanding the scope of your problem and you're not considering all of the problems that are brought on by doing this. Like, if this was just okay, we have a villain who's going to take over the United States and depower all the U.S. heroes. Like, that creates an interesting story about, like, okay, how does the rest of the world deal with this? What do they do with this? But they just throw that out the window halfway through. And I will get to that. I'm trying to do all these points in order and not get sidetracked, because every time I start talking, it's like, okay, well, talking about the size of, like, the scope, and then I'm like, well, they're also cutting off the multiverse somehow, and they're also, like, saying the Dark Universe doesn't exist somehow, and they're doing all these things and saying all these things are happening, and they're just kind of hand-waving so many things by expanding the scope of what they're trying to do. It's just... It's so hard to talk about this comic. Like, it's so hard to talk about this arc, because there's so many problems. Every time I'm like, oh, I'll focus on this one thing, I have to talk about 12 other things that are bad. So, I'm going to break down from this point 2 ideas, which I think are the 2 biggest problems with this whole event. Because beyond everything I've talked about so far, there are 2 major things which, if I had to remove everything and say, state the 2 problems, the 2 biggest problems. The first is obviously, the bigger the scope, the bigger your problem. And the second is, they've basically ruined another villain because they realized they weren't ready to do another, like, global event. Like, they didn't have a villain, so they just ruined Amanda Waller's character. And I don't think I have to explain who Amanda Waller is. I feel like she's a big enough villain at this point that everybody kind of knows her deal. And her strength as a character is that she's smart and ruthless and is completely unfazed, I guess you could say, by all of these, like, superpowered beings. Like, she's crafty and smart and knows what to do. And knows how to leverage things against people. And so she doesn't need to be a global level threat. Like, she doesn't need to wield that kind of power because she's already threatening on a level that most comics don't like to go to. Like, I've said this before, I think, when it comes to scope and it comes to, like, how do you write a story with superheroes, you don't have to write every story where they're facing down somebody with the powers of a nuclear weapon. They don't have to be super destructive and have a super high body count. They don't need to do this to be threatening. And Amanda Waller is like Exhibit A on how you write a villain to where they don't need to directly kill people to be super dangerous to a hero. It's enough that she's crafty enough to manipulate people and probe at their weaknesses. Like, she's still a threat even though she's not like Superman. You know, like, she can still face Superman because she's capable of manipulating all the things that Superman doesn't want to deal with. Like, she can go after his, or like, Superman's friends and family and stuff. And that's kind of what makes her a good villain, because she stands out in a world where all of the villains have kind of turned into just serial killers, I guess. But this comic throws all of that out the window. And I kind of knew it was going to be like that as soon as I read the first issue of the sudden retconning of her backstory. Like, they tried to make a comic where they talk about why she's doing what she's doing and give her rationale for why she suddenly wants to just smash the world or smash all worlds and just take over the multiverse. Like, they've just thrown her entire backstory out and started fresh, but they still want to use the characters like legacy, and it's just terrible because Amanda Waller does not need a sad backstory to be who she is. Nobody does. It's enough for her to be annoyed and angry and jealous of the fact that the world has been taken over essentially by sentient nuclear weapons. Like, the fact that she hates these people because of what they are and what they represent is enough. You don't need a tragic backstory where she basically has the Batman backstory of, oh, my father was killed and shit. Like, you don't need that. You don't. You really don't. And it kind of ruins her, because her not having a reason is way better than her having a tragic backstory. Her being a character who has a kind of like self-justification or I don't know what to call it, like self-actualization, but basically where she has like infinite amounts of belief in her cause is enough. I mean, that kind of makes her like Lex Luthor in a way, back when Lex Luthor wasn't terrible. But the fact that she doesn't have a backstory that's like super tragic is actually a net benefit, because it means that you can't do the stupid, oh, I'm doing this to save the world bullshit. It's enough for her to be like, I'm right, and I think I'm right, and I'm going to prove I'm right by any means necessary. Like, that is a good enough backstory. You don't need to give her a tragic backstory. But the other problem is that they just completely throw her character out and take her to levels of like power that are absurd. Like, she's like, oh, off camera, I made an agreement with the Universal Alliance of Planets or whatever, so the Green Lanterns won't step in. Like, okay, when did you do this? How did you do this? Why would they take you seriously when you're not a representative of Earth at all? Like, how do you make this agreement? Why would they take it seriously? Why would they even like humor you? Like, there's no reason to do that. She's not like a world leader. There's no reason for her to like reach out to them. How did she reach out to them? Like, why wouldn't they just completely disregard whatever she says? You know, there's no reason for her to like be in that position. And then she's like, okay, I sealed off the multiverse. How did you do this? Why did you do this? Like, because also it's bullshit, because she didn't seal off the multiverse, because she opens the door to the multiverse in these comics, and then she starts talking to like other Justice Leagues who all apparently like sign up with her for no reason. Like, she talks to the Earth 3 like, what are they called? Not the Villain Syndicate. I always call them the Injustice Society, but that's not who they are. The Justice Syndicate? I don't remember what their fucking name is. It's the Earth 3 guys with Ultraman and Superwoman. I forget off the top of my head. My memory's not the best right now. But, like, they just agree to go along with it, and you could make the argument that she's had dealings with them in the past, but then she starts making deals with, like, Earth 10, and Earth 10 is the Nazi Earth, where like Overgirl is from, and they have like Nazi superhumans and Superman's a Nazi and shit, and it's like, why would they agree to go along with you? Why would they agree to join you? Like, why? Why are they all like going along with this? Why would they be like, oh yes, Amanda Waller, we totally are going to allow you to, run the multiverse? It doesn't make any sense. Like, it literally doesn't. They're just there. And it's like, you don't need them to be there. You don't need them to, like, add stakes. And they go even further because they turn this into a global conflict. Like, you didn't need to do that. It would have been enough if, like, Amanda Waller is like, I'm going to take all of the American superheroes off the board. And I'm going to do it with my own team of superhumans, which in this case are all Mazo robots. And she's like, okay, I'll use them and take over the and take out the superhumans, and then like I'll install myself as ruler of the United States, which is what she kind of does, but they don't spend enough time on what she's doing. So her taking over the world is a like side story. Like, it just happens. Like, they begin one of the event comics with her being like, oh, I just decided to relieve the US government of its role. I decided I'm just going to take over the world. It's like a side note. It's just thrown out there for no reason. It doesn't make any sense. Like, in order for this to make sense, if you want your villain to be the main character, what you need is, like, you need Amanda Waller to have a scene with the president where the president goes, I don't approve of this, and I don't approve of what you're doing, so I'm relieving you. And her going, that's cool, I don't care. And just using the Amazos to take over the country. Like, that's what you should do. You need that scene, and that scene is just absent. Like, there's no scene where anybody pushes back on her. She just is like, oh yeah, I took over the United States, and got rid of all the superhumans, and that's just how it is. Like, it's treated as just a thing that happened, like one more thing that happened. And it goes further than this. It gets insulting, like, it gets insultingly bad. Because if you had it, like, it just throws out, okay, I've taken over the world, and I've started operating in other countries. And it's like, okay, there are superhumans in other countries. Okay? There are extremely dangerous superhumans in other countries. Like, Black Adam is dangerous, obviously, but I'm talking like the Great 10 exist. There are multiple superhero teams in other countries. There are, many different kinds of superhumans in other countries. And she just, like, off camera kidnaps the Great 10, and there's a scene in the beginning of, like, there's a scene in the beginning of one of the comics where, like, the Chinese are like, hey, she kidnapped all the members of the Great 10. Why are we not doing anything about this? And she just appears and is like, you can all, like, draft your, the statement saying how happy you are that I've done this, and also I'm taking over the world. Like, this is stupid on so many levels, because it should have been assumed that the Chinese probably have their own ability to do something like this. Like, this is one of my biggest gripes with modern comics, where they want a global sense of superhuman activity, but they never take that to its logical conclusion. Ever. Or at least they haven't in a very long time, since, like, the end of 52, which was a decade ago. More than that at this point. So, just to make things clear about what I'm talking about, I'll briefly cover World War III, because I imagine most people haven't read it. Basically, at the end of 52, Black Adam has lost everything. So one of the major story arcs in 52 is Black Adam reforming. So he meets his wife Isis and her brother Amon, and they bring in Sobek, and they create a family, and she basically gets Black Adam to be less harsh. So Black Adam starts out by being like, they're evil, so I kill them. And she's like, no, you shouldn't do that. you should be merciful, you should be just, you shouldn't do all these things. And Black Adam at first is kind of like, I don't know about that. And he's making agreements with like the Russians and the Chinese to oppose like America and everyone else. And she's like, no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't be so aggressive, things like that. And Black Adam's like, okay. But then it bites him in the ass because it turns out that Sobek is actually a creation of Intergang, and he's actually one of the Four Horsemen, and then the Four Horsemen kill Isis and Amon, and Black Adam like loses his fucking mind. Like he just loses his mind and goes insane, and he murders an entire country, and then he proceeds to cut a bloody swath across the globe, where he's just like murdering everybody in his path because he's so angry. And during the course of this, he finds out that the people behind this, the people behind Sobek's creation, were the Chinese, specifically one of the members of the Great Ten, and it was all orchestrated by August General in Irons, who is kind of like, I don't want to say he's like the Batman of the Great Ten, but he kind of is, in terms of like his paranoia and everything. But basically it comes out that the Chinese worked with Intergang to try to kill Black Adam because he retreated from their mutual defense pact. And they didn't like that. So they wanted to show him that they meant business. And Black Adam proceeds to one by one kill every member of the Great Ten. And it takes the Titans, the Justice League, the Justice Society of America all working together to defeat Black Adam. But what makes this like event comic actually kind of good is that it explores the limits of modern superheroing, where modern superheroes can't just go anywhere and do anything. So there's a scene where I think it's Alan Scott is sitting there with all the rest of the superheroes who are all Westerners, and they're sitting there at the border of Chinese airspace. And the reason is that the Chinese have refused to let any of them enter to help them. They insist that there is no problem, that the Great Ten are handling it, that they don't need international assistance. And this is obviously a lie, and all of them know about this, but it creates a moral dilemma for all of these heroes, because on one hand, if they cross into Chinese airspace, if they cross into Chinese territory to help, to do the right thing, essentially, they are committing a crime, an international crime, because they are violating another state's sovereign borders that has said that they don't want them there. And this is a dilemma. It's a real dilemma that has weight. And obviously the Chinese then are like, yeah, you can totally come in and deal with him because the Great Ten are all basically dead at that point. And they make the decision that it's better to let them in to deal with this problem than to keep being stubborn, essentially. But the moment itself is what I'm getting at, is that it's a good representation of the stakes and showing that there is in fact an international like scene, I guess you could say, where there's like different superheroes and supervillains and stuff in other societies, and that they have equal weight to Western ones, where like, yeah, Superman might want to go in China, but the Chinese don't want him to, and if he does, it's a crime, and he should expect to pay for it, kind of thing. In this comic, in Absolute Power, it's this kind of great power conflict is treated as like an offhand thing that doesn't matter. So Amanda Waller off screen just kidnaps the Great Ten, who again are like global dangers in terms of like what they can do. She just does it, and it's just like, oh yeah, I'm just going to dictate to the Chinese party like what's going on, because I no longer need governments. I am now, with my Amazos, better than everyone else, and I can do whatever I want. Like, she invades Atlantis and starts destroying things to kidnap Arthur Curry, like kidnap Aquaman, which again doesn't really make sense, because again, Atlantis has invaded the surface world and shown that they are just as technologically capable of taking over the Earth as anyone else, so this really doesn't make any sense, but it happened. But my point is, like, it's expanding the scope in such a way that you have to start hand waving things, and the more things you hand wave, the more your story sucks, because the plot holes grow in number and they start getting much bigger. You know, like, I was already going, okay, so she's taken over the world, so none of the other superhumans, like the Great 10, who are the biggest ones, have done anything. And then next issue, it's like, oh yeah, I totally just took care of them. It's like, okay, well, so she's taking over the world, so nobody's doing anything about the multiverse. Like, all the times they've done it, nobody's inserting themselves. Oh, she's somehow cut off this entire dimension. She's cut off the entirety of Earth 2 from the multiverse. How? Why? No idea. And also, like I said, she didn't actually do that because she created a portal that allows her to open it up. So she hasn't cut anything off, and I don't know how she even cut it off to begin with, because it's never mentioned in any of the issues. It's just not mentioned. It's not a thing they care about, but they just hand wave it, and it's like, you can't hand wave something like that. You know? Like, you can't just hand wave any of this. The other issue is, it's like, the depowering thing doesn't make any sense. At all. Full stop. It doesn't. Like, the concept of the Amazo, like, can depower just anyone. Like, the Amazos are just capable of depowering equally. Superman, who's an alien, like, okay, he has limits, and you could feasibly depower him. It's been done before. But, okay, also they can use the Speed Force. Also, they can depower Green Lantern Ring somehow. Also, they can, like, depower people who aren't superhumans at all. Like, Wonder Woman is not like, superhuman. I mean, she is, but she doesn't have, like, superpowers because they're innate. And not like an alien innate. Like, okay, the Amazos can also stop magic. This feels like a third grader wrote it about their super cool new, like, villain. But it's like, Wonder Woman is a character who is empowered by the gods literally, and, like, I don't know how you strip that away from her. Like, even magically. Like, I don't know how you do that. Because it said, okay, they depowered the Lasso of Truth. So for those of you who don't know, the Lasso of Truth is, I think, from Hestia, and it's a literal mystical artifact. Like, it's also, like, a gift from a god, and shouldn't depowering it have, like, major repercussions? You know, like it's always so weird when they do this, and they're like, okay, we're just gonna shit on the fact that there are literal gods in this universe, and they have literal magic artifacts, and we're gonna do things to them, and the gods just kind of shrug, and they have to, like, do a hand wave for why the gods haven't done anything this time. And there's a, like, 3-second aside in the Captain Marvel issues, I think, where they say that Captain Marvel has tried to, like, talk to the gods and be like, hey, why aren't you doing anything? And them being like, oh, this is a man issue. Like, this is a mankind issue. We don't do anything with that. And it's like, cool, Amanda Waller is just spitting in the face of the gods. And the gods are just like, whatever. Which is, like, not how the gods usually react to things in comics at all. Like, but it just doesn't make any sense. Like, they came up with the idea, the Amazo depowers Wonder Woman's lasso and depowers Wonder Woman. Like, they came out with this idea first. And then they were like, oh, what do we do with that now? Like, what are the effects of this? And they just were like, don't worry about it, keep writing. If we keep writing, maybe we can outrun all of the plot holes. This is another thing about depowering ideas. Like, with the God Wave depowering everyone, it kind of made sense, because they were like, this is a power that is from creation itself. This power created the gods. So obviously it can depower everyone, because it's a power that created the gods. You know, it's the source of everything. So it can do that. Like, okay, that makes sense. The Amazos, it doesn't make sense. Like, again, Wonder Woman is not, like, invoking power. She's naturally that strong because she was made of fucking clay. So if you're gonna depower her, shouldn't she just revert to clay at that point? You know? It's also like, okay, you're gonna, I don't know, you're gonna like depower like Hawkgirl. Again, Hawkgirl doesn't have any superpowers aside from the wings, and even then, she's just a really strong alien. It doesn't really make sense that you can depower that. Like, this happens, and it doesn't make any sense. But the thing I'm harping on now is that they're doing things that create more plot holes. Like, they're doing things where it's like, okay, we depowered Wonder Woman and we took away the divine power for Lasso. I can excuse Captain Marvel and Black Adam because it's like, okay, their magical power has been deprived of them. I don't know how they depowered Zatanna because her thing is that she can speak backwards, and just the act of speaking backwards creates magic. Like, I don't know how you depower that. I just don't. Like, none of this makes any sense at all. It's just, we just keep adding new plot holes because we wrote the story idea first and then didn't think about it. It's really sloppy writing. And I mean, I could rant about, like, one of the Amazos entering the Speed Force, because that's just dumb. Like, I already hate the Speed Force as a concept. I do. Like, we didn't, because, again, the Speed Force is kind of in the same boat as Green Lantern's powers, where every comic now involving the Flash and the Flash family is just talking about the Speed Force and crises within the Speed Force and something is wrong with the Speed Force, and they never shut up about it. It's just really stupid, and all Flash comics have turned into, like, about the Speed Force and not about the Flash. And it's really, like, just not fun to read. It's repetitive and boring. But they're like, oh yeah, totally, like, one of the Amazos can now use the Speed Force and get into it, which doesn't make any sense. Because, again, they've already established and spent great pains establishing that the Speed Force is, like, sentient, in a way, and so it chooses who can use it and who can't, or who can access it and who can't, and things like that. And so the Amazo just being in the Speed Force doesn't make sense. It also doesn't make sense that he wouldn't immediately be set upon by, like, the Black Flash and beings like him. Also, being able to enter the Speed Force means he can time travel now, or should be able to, because, again, the Speed Force is bullshit and it exists to explain why the Flash can just do shit. But this writing mentality of we can outrun our plot holes if we just keep writing and don't address them is deep rooted within DC. It was in the Flash. It was all over the place when Geoff Johns was in charge, because that was his, like, method of writing, and it was everywhere. But it seeped into, like, every other comic and how they write. And so now you're like, okay, you have an Amazo, and the Amazo is, like, in the Speed Force. You have an Amazo that is imbued with all the powers of all the Supermen. It's just dumb. Like, it's just really stupid. And they fumble the ball because they don't create a situation where there's a good enough triumph. Okay? And this was another thing that came up again. This is the same problem with Dark Knight Metal. Because the way you're supposed to write a comic, in general anyway, is that you have 3 acts. Okay? Like, good comics, follow a certain 3-act structure, which is different from movies and stuff. But basically there's 3 parts to a good superhero comic, where the most basic story is kind of like, you have a hero doing something, and then a villain appears. That's Act 1. Then the villain wins, or seems to win. That's Act 2. And then Act 3 is the hero defeating the villain. Okay, that's Act 3. Modern DC Comics omit Act 3. So it's just Act 2 continued. Alright, where there's not, like, the moment of triumph. It's just like, oh, this happened and now we've won. And then we move on. Like, there's no moment of glory. And this happened in, like I said, Dark Knight Metal is a great example, where they have a very specific setup. Like, you start off, and there are heroes, and then you have Batman, like different versions of Batman who all have different abilities of the Justice League. So you have like a Flash Batman, you have like a Green Lantern Batman, you have a Superman Batman, you have a Wonder Woman Batman, you have an Aquaman Batman. Okay, and Act 2 is them defeating the Justice League. Act 2 is them being like, okay, we outwitted you, we defeated you with your own powers. And then Act 3 should be the heroes going, you don't actually know how our powers work, you're just knockoffs. So what Act 3 should be is the heroes who were beaten defeating their doppelgangers. So for example, the Flash should defeat the Batman Flash. The whatever Green Lantern is fighting, whoever the Green Lantern is, should defeat Green Lantern Batman. Wonder Woman should be able to defeat Wonder Woman Batman, etc. Because it shows that they're better than the villain. It shows that they understand their powers more. They understand where they come from more. But that doesn't happen in Dark Knight Metal. In Dark Knight Metal, the final showdown is between the Batman Who Laughs and Batman, and there's never a moment of triumph for any of the other characters. There's never a moment where they're able to overcome the odds, basically. Like, there's never a moment where they right the scales and show that they weren't as bad, basically. Like, there's never a moment where that happens. And that's a problem, because you basically have just shown that they're all geeks. Like, they're all terrible. Like, that's what you've done. If they don't come back and overcome the odds, and all you're saying is that the versions of Batman with their powers were all universally better. And that's what happens here. Because, like, okay, the Amazos no longer have their powers, or no longer can take their powers away. What you should do in this situation is have a fight scene where they face each other, and the people who had the powers before defeat the new guys. Like, that's what should happen. Like, you should have Superman defeat the Superman Amazo in a fight. You should have the Flash, like the Flash and his family defeat the Flash Amazo. You should have Wonder Woman defeat, her Amazo, etc. You should be in a position where you're writing the scene where they defeat them, and it's not just, oh, they were shut down, so now they lose. Like, there's no redemption arc. There's no, like, moment where they overcome. There's no moment where, the old guys prove to be better than the new model. There's no moment where they show that they're better with their powers than the Amazos are with their powers. It's just, oh, we depowered the Amazos, so we destroyed them. It's not interesting, and it's not satisfying. It just doesn't work. This way of writing a story doesn't work. You could write this kind of story in some cases. You can write this sort of story in, like, if your whole goal is to write a downer ending, this is how you do it. But I don't think they're trying to write a downer ending. I think they're trying to, like, act like this is a huge triumph where Amanda Waller is defeated and the world is safe for superhumans again. And it's just not very interesting, because none of the people who were wronged ever get redemption or get to strike back. So it's just kind of, like, dull and uninteresting. And that's kind of like the two main points, but the other kind of main point I need to make, and this kind of dovetails with the end of that topic, is that nothing changes in the DC universe. And I don't mean you should want to change the DC universe constantly. You shouldn't. But what I mean is that when you write a global conflict, if you're going to write a comic that has global implications, you should not be returning to the status quo at the end of it. Okay? You should not be writing a comic where it's like there was a global upheaval and everything went back to normal. That's not how it doesn't work. Like, it doesn't work from a narrative standpoint, but it also doesn't work just from a plausibility standpoint. Like, I've always had this kind of problem with comics in general, where Like, Gotham City has been destroyed several times, and yet nothing ever changes. Like it just, like, there was a comic, and I'm blanking on the name of it, where No Man's Land. No, I'm not. It's No Man's Land. So there was a comic where they just sealed off Gotham City from the rest of the world in No Man's Land, and then like went back after the fact, like nothing happened. It made no sense. It made no sense then with a better comic. No Man's Land is a better comic, but it makes even less sense here because at least there that was like one city. This is the entire globe, and it makes no sense. And it makes really no sense when a character dies in this comic arc, which is part of the paint by numbers. Oh, beloved character dies during the comic. That's like another check mark on the list of things you need in every event comic. In this case, it's Nia Now, I think her name is. It's Dreamer. Where she's working for Waller because Waller took her family hostage, and then she dies, and then you're like, okay, they just killed her off, and then she comes back and she's like, no, I didn't die because Jonathan Kent dreamed me, and so I was still alive in the dream world. And it's just like, okay, so you've just completely undercut the concept of this character dying. Ever. Like, ever again. Like, deaths in comics already don't mean anything, but it really doesn't mean anything if she dies and comes back in 2 issues. Like, why bother? Why did you bother killing her off and then having her come back 2 issues later if you weren't, like, what's the point? But the other thing is they pull the okay, a hero needs to become a villain card. Another check mark. Hero becomes villain. Like, pick some popular hero, turn them into a villain by having them completely go against everything they believe in. In this case, it's Green Arrow, where they're like, Green Arrow becomes a fascist. And it's like, okay, so Green Arrow is a fascist, despite the fact that Green Arrow for, I don't know, like, I don't know how many decades at this point it's been. Like, Green Arrow is a golden age hero, and he's been a bleeding heart liberal the entire time. His best comic run was probably in the 1980s, I think, with Green Lantern, where they were like paired together because Hal Jordan was like a Republican and Oliver Queen is a liberal, like Democrat, and their partnership contrasts the two of them, and it worked. But turning Green Arrow into a fascist doesn't work, and it's just kind of miserable and just kills the character stone dead. And it doesn't matter that he intentionally came up with this plan and decided to have Martian Manhunter brainwash him so that he could do this effectively and seriously believed that his morals have changed. It doesn't matter. It's still stupid, like, on its face. Like, it's absolutely stupid on its face. But it's even more stupid because there's a scene in the Green Arrow issue immediately after Absolute Power where he sees Amanda Waller in jail and he's like, if you threaten my family, I'll kill you. And this is really stupid. And not because, heroes shouldn't kill. That's not it. It's stupid because they've already done this. Again, this is another repeating things that have happened in other comics, but worse. So those of you who don't remember, one of the biggest things to happen to Green Arrow is the death, like destruction of his city, and the death of his granddaughter. Well, not really granddaughter, more like grandniece. I don't know, what would you call it? Roy Harper's kid, Lian Harper. Okay. Basically, the whole story of that arc is Prometheus, whose superpower is that he collects data and puts it into a helmet, and so he can easily predict all of what the heroes are going to do. So he makes up this huge plan where he uses the supervillain Chemo, who's just a walking nuclear bomb, and he detonates Chemo in Star City, leveling the city. And it kills Lian Harper, the kid of Roy Harper. And he beats Roy Harper basically within an inch of his life and cuts off Roy Harper's arm. And he's in jail. But then he's allowed out, basically. Like, he's allowed out, and Green Arrow decides that this has gone too far. Green Arrow decides that the death of Leon Harper and the destruction of his city is too far, and that he cannot personally allow Prometheus to continue. And so, I forget who he uses, but he opens up a doorway into Prometheus's room, and he shoots Prometheus through the head with an arrow. And he doesn't even try to hide the fact that he's killed Prometheus, because him killing Prometheus is his revenge for what Prometheus did. And he knows he crossed that line, but he made the conscious choice to go against everything he believes in because of the death of a loved one. And it's a good arc. It's bad for all of the characters involved. Like, this led to Trucker Hat Roy Harper and just some of the worst comics that have ever come out. Like, it was a bad, like, result in terms of the future, but in terms of writing a good story, this was good. Like, this character moment is good, where Oliver Queen, guy super lefty liberal, hates the death penalty, doesn't believe heroes should kill, is super old school Robin Hood. The death of a loved one by Prometheus changes him, and he says, I can't let this man live. I can't live with myself if I know he's still out there and can do it. And so he kills Prometheus. And it's a character moment. It's a big character moment, which, again, they did horrible things with. But it was a good character moment. This is way worse. Because they have Green Arrow be like, if you go after my family, I'll kill you. And it's like, okay, so nothing happened to your family, and also you threatening to kill her doesn't matter because you've already, like, yeah, you proved that you were willing to betray literally everyone in order to save them like a moron, but your threat doesn't really make any sense because you chose to do all of this. Like, lots of people supposedly died or did die because of this. So he's, by extension, killed a lot of people, and like, there's no consequences for this, but also it just doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense from the perspective of his character to threaten this, because he's supposed to be the kind of character who will never cross that line, or at the very least believes that he's never going to cross that line. He's kind of like Batman in that way, where both of the characters are like, I will never kill someone. And Green Arrow, at least in that comic, did, and was willing to do it because of, his own personal feelings, essentially. Like, a line had been crossed that he didn't know would be crossed, and it pushed him over the edge, and he acted. Like, this case is just him threatening it, and it's clearly trying to call back to that because they're doing the same story beat, but it's way lamer here because, again, he helped her do this. Like, he helped her do all the bad things. Like, he threatened his own family in this situation. Like, everything that happened is his fault. The reason why Amanda Waller was able to do everything was because he helped her do this. Because of his own stupid plan. Also, they have him become the guy who thinks that the Justice League needs to exist, which is not who Green Arrow is at all. Like, I'm gonna be really old here and to ask you to remember Justice League Unlimited. Way back in the day. Justice League Unlimited. I think it's the very first episode of Justice League Unlimited, actually. But the story in that episode is Green Lantern is asked to join the Justice League. And he's like, absolutely not. Because the thing is that you all sit up in this huge tower, this huge watchtower, and you look down on the earth like gods. And while you're doing that, while you're fighting the big monsters, somebody is having their purse stolen. A mugger is killing someone. A bank robbery is happening. You guys are not able to deal with those problems because you're so used to dealing with the big guys that you forget about the little guy. Because again, Green Arrow is a bleeding heart liberal who believes in the little guy. Like, his whole thing is about being a small street level guy who explicitly doesn't like the idea of trying to operate on a global scale because he wants to deal with the little guy. And so in that episode, which is a great episode by the way, he's brought on to deal with this rampaging, out of control, nuclear powered behemoth, basically. And, while he's dealing with that, he sees that, there's lots of little people being crushed under heel, essentially, by this huge monstrosity. And while he doesn't change his outlook in the sense of like, yeah, you should totally support the little guy, he understands that the Justice League is a necessary thing, or at the very least, is a thing that should exist. Contrast that with this comic, where the end goal is him creating the Justice League, and he thought that the best way to do this was to have Amanda Waller take over the world with Amazos. Okay? Where he ends it with, hey, you know how we gave Amanda Waller absolute power over the globe? Yeah, it should actually be us, the Justice League. Like, we need to build a new watchtower, and also we need to rule as arbiters over the globe. Now, this is stupid for a lot of reasons, namely because, again, this is a world that supposedly has many groups of superhumans in many countries, and so the concept of a global Justice League in space doesn't make a whole lot of sense in this case. Like, Justice League Unlimited, it made sense because, like, things like the Great 10 didn't exist. So you could say all of the superhuman people were all in America or roughly that area, and so they could all, like, reasonably say, okay, we're not just American superheroes now, we are global superhumans now. And that made sense. This makes no sense, because what they're doing is saying, okay, the problem with Amanda Waller taking over the world was there wasn't a Justice League. And who are we going to bring into the Justice League for the globe? All of the people who were in it before. So only American superheroes. It doesn't make sense. It legitimately doesn't make sense. It's really stupid. It's even stupider that all of his friends forgive him for doing this. Like, hey, I know you got like thousands of people killed, and you threw us all in a gulag, and you helped a woman take over the world because you thought it was necessary. But yeah, you can totally be a member of the Justice League and run it, because you've shown that you have absolutely terrible sense of how to deal with problems. Like, you have terrible judgment, so you should totally be in charge of the Justice League. Like, this is a bad idea. Like, it's a really bad idea. It's a stupid concept that is transparently designed to attempt to fix Green Arrow, because he's been a villain now for a few months, and was transparently doing the wrong thing, and his explanation for why he did it is stupid, and so he's still an asshole who did the wrong thing and threw all of his friends into a gulag. Like, they had the same problem in Marvel when Civil War happened, and they were like, oh yeah, so Tony Stark and everybody who went along with him are giant assholes, and they really aren't heroes, and this is the sort of stain that doesn't come off easily, and they didn't know how to fix it, and so for like the next decade, Tony Stark was basically villain adjacent through all of it. They're doing the same thing here with Green Arrow, where they're transparently trying to rehabilitate him after the fact, and it just isn't going to work. Like, it just is not going to work, because in order to do this, they've had to make the character do everything that's against his like entire reason for being. And yeah, I don't know. It would be like if you had a Superman issue where Superman stomps on a puppy because he's like, this is the only way to stop the future apocalypse where puppies take over the world and murder everyone. And then 3 issues later, it was like, no, I was mind controlled, and also now I'm gonna run like I don't know, the JSA. And it'd be like, that doesn't make any sense, Superman. You did a horrible, horrible thing. Even if you thought it was the right thing to do. You did a horrible thing and didn't explain yourself and got a whole lot of people killed. And also, you still did that really bad thing. Like, this doesn't erase the fact that you did this really bad thing. Like, it's so stupid. It's just so stupid and just such bad writing. You don't have to do this. You could have used anyone. In fact, they should have used Hal Jordan, because that would have made more sense. Green Lantern taking over the world, that would have made more sense. Green Lantern, who is on the outs with the, the I don't remember what they call it. It's like the Green Lantern comics are stupid right now and don't make any sense anyway, and I've already ranted about them, but if Hal Jordan, who apparently built a, power battery on Earth, was like, hey, the rest of the world, the rest of the universe is dangerous now, and the only way I can save the world, the only way I can save Earth, is by taking it over and making Earth so dangerous that the Green Lanterns who are currently being used won't do it instead. So the only way I can protect the Earth is by taking over the Earth. That would be more understandable. Because at least it would stick with Hal Jordan's principles. And Hal Jordan has always, made bad decisions. There was the whole Parallax thing where he literally, tried to destroy space and time and create a new universe. But at least it sticks with his, right-wing ideology, or at least, belief in law and order, because he's a cop. That would make sense, Hal Jordan being hey, in order to save the world, I need to give it over to Amanda Waller, because only then will the rest of the universe be too afraid to hurt the Earth. That's stupid, but at least it doesn't destroy his character, because it's still in line with his core beliefs, perverted as they are. But this makes even less sense, because again, Green Arrow is a historically liberal character. Green Arrow has a century of history of being a flaming liberal. I do not know why they thought he was a good fit for this and being a fascist. It's just really stupid. It's just, I don't know. So I guess what they were trying, and this kind of gets back to, okay, what are we doing here? What's the purpose of this story? Why did they write it? Why are we writing this story? And the only thing I can think of is they wanted to bring the Justice League back, and they wanted to make them heroes again, and they wanted to, cut the universe off from the multiverse for the most part, because they felt there were too many multiversal shenanigans going on. And I guess they figured that if they can't do another Crisis, they might as well do this. So they're okay, we're going to reset the board by recreating the Justice League and recreating the need for them and removing the multiverse from the equation. Which doesn't make sense. The story the goal of their story and the story they wrote do not match at all. And so it doesn't work. And it's just a really bad story. And honestly, I hate it. You should not be back at a status quo at the end of a story like this. You shouldn't. And ultimately, I think everybody is worse off. Everybody involved in the comic, the company, the stories, the characters, everything is worse off than before. Nothing is good because of this comic. Nothing is improved because of this comic. Nothing is gained from this comic. You'd be better off without it. If you didn't write it. I guess the idea is to reset the board, but it just does it in the worst way possible, where everybody looks bad, and the result is just, I don't know, it's unpleasant, is I guess the right word to say. The company is not better off than it was before, because it's dragged so many characters through the mud, and Having done so, like, all of them look bad. It's ruined a villain that didn't need to be ruined. It ruined a hero that didn't need to be ruined. It told a story that wasn't good and opened the door for a bunch of comics which aren't good. or won't be good, I should say. Absolute Superman, Absolute Wonder Woman, Absolute Batman, all of them are going to be bad. At least so far. Like, I don't need to read more gritty, grimdark. Oh man, what if Superman was bitter and angry? What if Batman was bitter and angry? Like, 2002 called. We already had All-Star Batman and Robin. We don't need more. We don't need Wonder Woman who's bitter and angry. Like, congrats. Everything has a red color scheme. And everything's all angry and, like, edgelordy. Like, congrats. Like, the DC reboot happened. Again. I don't know if those of you remember the DC reboot where everybody's caught. Like, everybody involved, all the characters had like a red and black color scheme, and everything was gritty and stupid. It was just bad, and that's that's the vibe I get from the Absolute stuff. Like, none of it's good, and the result is that every character involved looks worse coming out of it than going in, and it doesn't have a satisfying conclusion. It's just bad. It's just really bad. Like, that's the thing. Like, this is such a terrible event comic. And unfortunately, all event comics are kind of awful now. Like, I don't know why they do event comics, because they're all terrible. Like, I don't know if they even drive sales anymore. Because, like, maybe in the beginning, 20 years ago, they drove sales. You know, I remember when Civil War came out, and they were like, oh man, event comic. And everybody's like, oh, we gotta read this, see what happens next. Nothing in any of these comics is noteworthy. Nothing in Absolute Power is worth reading. There's no comics here, not one, that's worth reading or worth, like, subjecting yourself to. They're all dull, uninteresting, and boring. Like, it's just not good. Like, transparently not good, and it's just not written very well. Like, I feel like I've talked at length about, like, narratively why you don't do stuff like this. I try very hard not to be, like, personal, or at the very least, I try to avoid subjective criticism when I can, because I want to show why you don't write the way this is written. Like, my purpose in talking about other better comics is to be like, this is how you do it, and this is why. Like, Absolute Power is an event comic where the goals don't make sense, and the writing they did to meet the goal doesn't make sense, and nothing looks better at the end. Like, there's no moment of triumph, there's no good feeling, there's no, like, desire to read more. A good event comic, if you were going to write a good event comic, should make you more interested in a character's solo run. Like, if you were going to write a good event comic, you would want to be more interested in the characters, or at least one of the characters. Like, if you... And this was kind of the problem, again, with Civil War, going back in every event comic since, where they should leave you wanting to see the fallout of the event. And this doesn't do that. It makes me less interested in everything. So yeah. That's kind of it. There's nothing really else I can talk about with this without disassembling even more. Anyway, don't read Absolute Power. It's shit. Everything involved in it is bad. And the writing is terrible. The story stinks. That's it.